Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, a Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. Sorry you're not here in person this time, but that's okay. We can still get the show out.
Yes, I'm back in the Verde Antequera, Jose Luis, for now. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico, ready for another episode of Aina Rebos. That's Soberanía backwards.
Nice. Nice. You'll have to spell that out for me so I can get it right in the subtitles.
You know? So if you put this backwards, you can get some kind of devilish messages like the old LPs.
Right. What was it? John Lennon is dead, or what is it? No, Paul is dead. Paul is dead. Okay. All right. We got lots for you this week on the show. We're going to be talking about all of the recent challenges, crises, whatever you want to call it, for Sheinbaum. In fact, in the last episode, we said, what's going to be her first challenge? Well, life comes at you fast. Yes. And there's quite a few to talk about. The Supreme Court is once again trying to destabilize Mexican democracy. There's not another term for it. They are engaging in golpismo, coup plotting. They are running afoul of the democratic will of the people, and it's a very tense situation. But I do think that the president's handling quite well, and we'll get into that as well. We want to give you a quick update on the Mexico-U.S. gun lawsuit. There was a development, important one, that came up. Obviously, much of the challenges in Mexico related to organized crime and violence in this country stem from the fact that there are guns flowing in here like a river. And so there is a lawsuit that Mexico has launched around this, and there was an important development there. We'll give you an update on that. We want to start a new segment here. New government, new segment. It's called Good News from Mexico. Just stories that we want to highlight, something that maybe is underreported, or maybe the reports on it have been, manipulated or not been so honest in terms of its representation. And so we have a little bit of news here for that, and it's actually very relevant to people who are thinking about visiting Mexico. So we'll get into that. And of course, our classic segment, Losers and Haters. Hoo boy, as always, quite the piece to get into on that topic in this week's episode. Okay. So we're going to kind of go real quick here in terms of some of the major headlines that are presenting a challenge, that these are the things that Sheinbaum's government is going to have to address immediately. The first one we want to talk about is this one that actually has made headlines in the United States and the rest of the world, which is that a mayor murdered just days after taking office, Chilpancingo, which is in the state of Guerrero, which is obviously a state that has been heavily linked with organized crime activities. His name was Alejandro Arcos, was murdered in quite a vicious way. Apparently, he was and to clearly send a signal. He comes from the opposition Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, but this one obviously kind of speaks to the situation in this country around organized crime groups, around insecurity. We talked about the fact that one of the issues that there wasn't as much advancement as we would have hoped, as we would have liked to have seen around security, around crime, around the efforts to try to tackle organized crime groups and their activities and the violence that derives therein. And so this one was pretty big in terms of the splash in the headlines of what it says about the situation. Kurt, your thoughts about the situation in Mexico when it comes to the organized crime groups and the challenges that Sheinbaum has faced? I mean, here it is. This is the biggest piece of evidence that this is not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, Jose Luis. So it's interesting that in the last episode, the question was, what's the first crisis she's going to face? Right. And as you well said, right, life comes at you fast. Right. So Claudia Sheinbaum is inaugurated on October 1st. On October 2nd was the march commemorating the anniversary of the Tlatelolco massacre of 1968. It's actually funny that as I left your apartment after we recorded our in-person duo session there, the trolley got as far as the new trolleyway there, the tram. Got as far as Tlatelolco, and they said, everybody out. This is as far as we go today. So I actually walked right through the beginning of that march, which made it all the way down the Eje Central into the Zocalo, and there were some clashes there. Right? The next day, there was the shooting in Chiapas of migrants, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then the next day was, the Supreme Court issue, which we'll also talk about in a moment. So, get it, hit the ground running on this one, right? I mean, totally. Okay? And, in her way, the president has been asserting her authority in this very kind of poker face, kind of no nonsense way that characterized her government in Mexico City. And it's to be pointed out that one of the big successes of Claudia Sheinbaum as mayor/governor of Mexico City was bringing down violent crime. Right? Bringing down violent crime significantly by ranges of 40 to 60%, more than the national government level of about 20%. That's important, right? Now, Mexico City is not the country, right? And you can't immediately extrapolate an urban security policy to a country as big, as varied, as rural, as mountainous, as everything as Mexico. And a lot of the crime, particularly, has been in these rural areas, right? And outlying areas, which present a whole series of different challenges, challenges there. This is, as you said, something that's not going to be going away, right? And, one of the reforms among the 20 was the National Guard reform, which brings the National Guard under the umbrella of the Secretary of Defense, a very controversial reform, right? Part of that reform is administrative, right? When they set up the National Guard, they were pulling people from different, departments of the defunct federal police, the Marina, the army. And so they were kind of mashing them together, and a lot of them were under different labor regimes, right? So part of this reform is to unify the administrative part of that, so that they're all on the same page with regards to not having clashing labor rules and hiring rules and all kinds of stuff there, right? But, it is bringing the National Guard under the umbrella of the Secretary of Defense. Right? Now, those who support this reform point to militarized places that exist, in a lot of countries, France, Spain, and such. Right? But it's also a recognition that, this is a serious issue that, 90 homicides a day. The public has been largely patient with this problem, knowing that Morena inherited this, from the crime, kleptocracy, and contubernio, as we say in Spanish, of previous regimes with organized crime, right? As we saw, the former minister, the top cop there, Genaro Garcia Luna, under Felipe Calderon, has now been sentenced, for his collusion with the Sinaloa cartel. So people know that Morena inherited a big plate of you-know-what that they had to deal with. But they're now in their second period. And I think this is a recognition that, fighting cartels that have military strength, firepower, you simply, it's difficult to see how that can be done with, local and state police, which are historically inefficient in Mexico, and a federal police, which was totally infiltrated, which is why they got rid of them. So it was kind of an unfortunate bowing to the inevitable here. We don't have to like it to at least understand why it got to that, right? And so we'll see this going forward if Sheinbaum can replicate her good results in Mexico City on the national level.
That's right. You made a really good point, which is that this is now the second term of Morena. And obviously, the day that López Obrador took office, the dead in this country started to count under his name, and now the dead will start to count under Sheinbaum's name. That's right. And that presents a challenge in terms of actually trying to speak about what's happening in this country, because then we have the propagandists who call themselves journalists like Jorge Ramos, who go around and parade the big figure around saying, oh, look at this is the situation of Mexico. Their strategy isn't working. We heard over and over again this whole criticism of a campaign slogan, hugs not bullets, saying that as if that really was the security strategy, right? And so I think this is something that's top of her agenda. In fact, we're not even a week into her government, so there's things that are slowly rolling out, and tomorrow they will announce the security strategy. There have been hints of it in terms of what's going to be. You mentioned that there are parts of the country that are kind of hot spots. Well, the strategy is going to be about dedicating resources there, not just to security, obviously mobilizing the National Guard and other police forces and resources to be able to tackle organized crime groups and their activities, but the social element, which is the part of the hugs that was never talked about when it was talked about in English language media. There's actually going to be a new program. I believe it's called Mexicans Uniting the Country or something along those lines, aimed at young people to try to get them out of the path that leads them towards a life of violence. And so we'll see the details of that tomorrow. Obviously, we'll talk about it here on the program in the following week. But it's important that we talk about the reality on the ground, right? Like this, there's no utility in glossing over what's actually happening in the country. And there are incidents like this. Clearly, when you see this kind of level of violence, this kind of message is being sent by organized crime groups. And, it's difficult to say. There's so many politicians.
It's a way to try to intimidate the incoming president. You see this every time there's a transition. Every time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. That's right. Absolutely right. And I do think that it's also worth talking about this case here because one of the other issues that really resonated amongst English-speaking audiences are the question around migration. It was one of the things that I mentioned, saying that I wish there would have been a different policy in the last one. One of my criticisms has been around the migration policy. But we had this very lamentable incident where it appears that a group of migrants who were being trafficked, who were obviously, if you have that number of individuals in one single vehicle, it lends, I think, to the reasonable conclusion that they were participating or being the victims of a human trafficking, which is, deeply intertwined with the human mobility phenomenon in a country like Mexico, particularly on Mexico's southern border with Central America, with Guatemala. There is a lot of this, right? How do you actually get across the border? Well, you pay coyotes. Coyotes used to be kind of like freelancers. Now it's very much tied to organized crime. And the details of this have not been clearly established, but what we do know is that armed forces fired upon this vehicle for reasons that are still not clear to me. And I hope that the Attorney General's office actually clears up in terms of why this happened. Was it justified or not? And if it wasn't justified, that there is punishment, that the people who made the decision to fire upon this vehicle are held accountable if it wasn't justified. But the point being that that 6 migrants lost their lives, right? They were shot by the armed forces. There's no way of kind of dancing around that fact. And so this is part of the situation, right? And making sure that there is no impunity in this case, should it be that, it was not a justified use of force, which, it's too early to judge in that case. But again, it kind of speaks to the fact that these issues, these serious challenges that we have in this country, migration, sharing a border with Central America and the United States, being the transit point, its connection to organized crime groups, the long legacy of the armed forces not using force appropriately, right? I don't know if that was the case in this one, but we do know that historically that did happen, right? And so the complex situation this country faces, these are the things that Claudia Sheinbaum now has to address, being the president, la presidenta. So this is the situation, and we'll see how this continues to roll out in Mexico when it comes to the security situation right now.
Yeah, a couple of things to add to that. The migrants who, very sadly lost their lives were from Egypt, El Salvador, and Peru, which really gives you an idea of the global reach now of these migration channels coming up from Mexico, right? The global reach of it, right? And these waves of migration coming up from South America that all of a sudden Mexico is having to deal with. I had an interview up in Jacobin a few months ago with the anthropologist Leonardo Toledo, which really, I think, sheds some light on this. As a Chiapan anthropologist who's really been involved in this. And I recommend that to everyone because he really has a really interesting take on that. And it has a lot to do with 2 cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación, New Generation, fighting for the control of this very lucrative cross-border trade, which includes human trafficking. As Jose Luis pointed out, it's just very lucrative. And you put that into a tinderbox of a state with, social conflicts going back to the colony, right? And a very armed population. There was, of course, the Zapatista uprising in the 90s, and there was a lot of copycat groups that said, oh, well, look, the Zapatistas are getting all this attention when they have arms, so we're going to get arms. So it's a real tinderbox of social conflicts, basically and essentially a feudalistic economic model going into very recently, with the local caciques and bosses, governing things there and hopping from party to party, political party to political party. So it's a difficult situation in Chiapas. Like I said, what works in Mexico City will not necessarily work in Chiapas. It's a whole different kettle of fish. It is really different. It is really, really different for a whole, series of reasons. One of them is this cartel dispute over the border traffic, which actually even sent some Mexicans to seek refuge into Guatemala. Okay? Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. I think the other thing to point out is that they did the right thing in the two soldiers who did fire. They claimed there were detonations. We'll see. Were separados de sus cargos, right? So they've been removed from their positions, right? Pending this investigation, right? And Claudia Sheinbaum, the president, very correctly said they will be placed at the disposition of the Attorney General's office, the civil Attorney General's office. The civil Attorney General's office, right? Not the military tribunals. And this is important, right? And this is important when the National Guard reform, they write the secondary laws, right? The National Guard reform is constitutional. After they pass any constitutional reform, they then write the secondary laws that then apply the constitutional reform into law. And one of those has to be, civil trials in these kinds of cases, right? So any case that involves a civilian has to go to civilian courts and not military courts, which appears to be what's going to happen in this case.
Yeah. And expect pushback on that, right? Like the armed forces don't like that. They want to keep justice under their umbrella. And so there will likely be debates, discussions, lots of forces acting to make sure that that doesn't happen. So again, we'll have something to be vigilant about. One final comment on this topic, which is that we didn't get a chance to talk about it a lot just because there was so much happening. But, there was one moment in the previous government under López Obrador where El Mayo Zambada was detained under dubious, questionable circumstances, right, without the cooperation of Mexico. And that really lit a tinderbox that was ready to explode in this country. We're talking about a slightly different part of the country that was affected by that. Yeah. But nonetheless, it's worth emphasizing, right? When the then president said, this doesn't help, this is actually the fault of the United States, there's truth to that segment, right? To that statement. Where Ken Salazar responded saying, no, this has nothing to do with us. Well, when you make decisions like that, again, it's not exactly clear what happened. I can't believe it's been so long. We still don't know exactly what happened. But it appears that there was some kind of treason inside of their organization, and El Mayo Zambada unknowingly was taken to the United States. The United States claims that they were not involved in the operation, but of course they were, right? They were involved in those efforts to get Mayo Zambada into the United States. And all that does is create instability. All it does is create new groups that are fighting with each other, and that actually increases the violence. And it's often not part of the conversation. U.S. foreign policy, U.S. drug policy in the Americas is not interested in peace. It's interested in drug interdiction, at least on paper, but what it actually is about advancing foreign policy interests of the United States. And they don't care about the cost. They don't care that now there's a region of the country where there's a bunch of smaller heads of plaza who are fighting to be the new leader because they took away the old one. Now, I'm not saying that these organized crime group leaders should act freely and move around the country and all this kind of stuff. That's not my point. My point is that interference without the cooperation of Mexican agencies can lead to really unpredictable and dangerous outcomes where we have these kinds of situations. And who pays the price? In this case, it was a group of migrants who were just trying to flee what is likely an oppressive situation, be it socially, politically, or economically, trying to find opportunities. And ultimately, it cost them their life because of the situation. Why? Because, again, to go back to this, U.S. drug policy is backwards and needs to be radically changed, but it'll be a long time before we see that.
And actually very predictable, right? As soon as Mayo Zambada was apprehended, people said this is going to heat up the plaza in Sinaloa, right?
Yep.
If you just have this flashy strategy of picking off kingpins, for DAs to win elections in the U.S. and to get splashy headlines and to do perp walks, that's never going to solve anything. They're just going to, there's going to be turf wars, and a new kingpin or kingpins will take their place, and it will all continue. And, as you said repeatedly, very correctly, it's the Mexicans who put the bodies in this. I think over 100 people have been killed up in Culiacan since Mayo Zambada was apprehended.
Exactly. Okay, moving on to the other big news story, which is, of course, the hurricane. It's a very active hurricane season. In fact, before it began, they warned that there was going to be a lot. It looks like there's another one that's about to strike Florida. So, thinking about all of our brothers and sisters in Florida who are going to face a hurricane. But here in Mexico, once again, the state of Guerrero was heavily impacted by a hurricane. And Claudia actually went over the weekend, went to go evaluate the progress in terms of attending to the needs. But it is a very concerning situation in particular because we mentioned this last time, right? It was not even a year ago that Otis hit them. And now they're facing once again, people losing their homes, difficulty with access to food, the flooding, all of the economic loss. I mean, it's a very difficult situation. Every time this comes up, I think it's worth mentioning, right? I will never forget the reaction of some of the so-called environmentalists who almost acted like we deserved it for pursuing an energy sovereignty strategy, for not necessarily following the greenwashing strategy around energy production in Mexico, trying to use the environment and the very real challenge of climate change in order to limit our sovereign ability to pursue energy sovereignty and to use our natural resources the way that most countries do for the benefit of the population. No, the reaction was, this is what happens because you love oil, right? As if it was Mexican oil exclusively that is responsible for the climate change crisis that is happening in this country. But on that topic, I mean, one of the things that we have seen as well has been the heavy emphasis on renewable energy without abandoning the strategy of also pursuing energy sovereignty and maintaining control over key resources like oil, like lithium, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, Claudia's renewable strategy would not have been possible without AMLO's recovering Pemex and the Federal Electricity Commission. It wouldn't have been possible. They were dilapidated, and they were deliberately dilapidated to justify their sell-off. And that was the way it was heading. That was the way it was heading. If the Morena and the 4T hadn't intervened, they were going to try to get, public electricity production down to, 10, 15 single digits in order to just say, oh, well, we don't need this anymore. Let's get rid of it.
Yep.
And then totally hand over Mexican energy to the private sector, right?
Yeah.
Which could then come in with their splashy brochures and say, oh, we're ecological. That was the way it was heading. So what AMLO did was a necessary prerequisite to what Claudia's going to do in the second term. So don't listen to anybody trying to tell you, oh, she's doing exactly the opposite of AMLO, and she's just, she's negating what he done. No. She's building on the fact that he recovered the public sector to make it possible to now have a public-driven energy transition.
That's a great comment. It actually makes me think of something that I wanted to mention here, which is that watching the new Mañaneras, watching President Sheinbaum going through this exercise of governorship, it's quite interesting in comparison to 2018 when López Obrador first took office, where it seemed like really everything was concentrated in those early years on basically rescuing the state, trying to figure out how to make up for all of that lost time from the neoliberal era. In a way, Sheinbaum has the advantage of having, the dinner table is served. Like there's a lot more. She can talk about expanding and new things as opposed to having to focus on trying to rescue the welfare state out of the jaws of neoliberalism the way that López Obrador did. So it's been interesting to see her be able to kind of have more freedom to operate. And that kind of brings me to our next topic today, which is the Supreme Court coup plots. There are opponents to this.
They're back.
Claudia Sheinbaum is a powerful president. She has a supermajority in Congress. Her reforms are advancing. There is a population that backs her. Her predecessor left office with 70, 80% support. So, of course, the conspiracies, for lack of a better term, although I actually think it's appropriate here, start to brew. These undemocratic expressions of discontent with what the democratic mandate is actually trying to secure. And so I think you said it perfectly here in your tweet with this situation around the Supreme Court. Call it what it is. This is a coup attempt. So Kurt, maybe you can fill us in. What's going on with the Supreme Court? Why are we using this language to describe their actions as a coup attempt?
So very briefly, we talked about in previous episodes these desperate attempts by the judicial branch to stop the upcoming judicial reform, which provides for the direct election of the Supreme Court and federal justices. And that's starting. In 2025, there's going to be a special election in 2025, and then the other half of the federal judges will be elected in 2027. I think they're going to line it up with the midterm elections. Right? So that's happening. It's a fact. They couldn't stop it. Because you can't stop a judicial reform that's a constitutional amendment. Right? As we talked about, right, they tried to use a form of preliminary injunction called the amparo to freeze the debate in Congress, saying, you can't discuss this. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine judges saying, stop debating? Like the legislators have to freeze like this while they're talking, just like this. Stop. Right? Or if you do pass it, you can't send it to the state legislatures for ratification. I mean, it was just absurd on its face. It's clearly absurd to try to use an injunction called the amparo to freeze debate or to try to freeze the legislative process, right? This is what's called the constituyente, right? The constituyente is the power to amend the Constitution, to change the Constitution, right? Which comes from Article 39 of the Constitution that, the people have the right to change and modify their form of government. Right, so the public is the constituyente, and so when the Congress is debating constitutional reforms, it's the constituyente. So you can't use an injunction to stop it. It's silly, right? And actually, the amparo law says you can't. Right. So it was passed and it was ratified, obviously, right? Despite these silly attempts at injunctions. So now they're trying something else. They're trying something else, right? They dug into their drawers there. They dug into the cabinets, and they found this organic law. It's called an organic law because it regulates how the judicial branch operates. It's like basically an administrative law that regulates how things are supposed to run over there, right? So it's a very minor law. It's an administrative law saying this is how this works, right? And one clause in that is that, well, they have a say on things that affect the judicial branch. So they dug out this administrative law and try to hold this up saying, oh, look, we can use this to debate the constitutionality of the judicial reform. It's like, well, how can you declare something that's in the Constitution is unconstitutional? Because you can't, because it's in the Constitution. See, if it's in the Constitution, it's not in the Constitutional because it's in the Constitution. And it's going forward, right? Just today, in the Mañanera, in the press conference, Claudia Sheinbaum announced that they're sending the secondary laws to Congress to be, debated and approved, right? It's going to lay out how the elections are going to take place. Okay? And this is what they're trying. So they voted 8-3 to admit this ridiculous procedure, right? They didn't vote yet to rule the Constitution unconstitutional. That would require a separate vote. But what they're doing is they're sending up a trial balloon to their international backers. They're sending up a trial balloon to the U.S., to the Organization of American States, the International Human Rights Commission, right, which is also discussing this coincidentally at the same time and saying, look what we're doing. Look what we're doing. Do you want to intervene here? Do you want to do something about this? If the U.S. backs out of this, they can always just say, oh, well, we never really meant to, overrule the Constitution. We were just debating, right? They always have their out. They can just always back off and say, oh, we were just debating. Everybody who's saying it's a coup is just exaggerated. We never meant this. But if their international backers jump on board, then they'll try to go forward. But it's interesting how they have that weaselly out. If they don't get the international support they're expecting, they'll just say, oh, we never meant to do it. We were just debating. We were just discussing. It was just a debate. But it's on the table now for them to attempt to set up this vote, to then attempt to portray incoming President Sheinbaum, right, as disobeying a ruling of the Supreme Court. That's what they're trying. However spurious and ridiculous that might be, right? So you see over here on the screen, our friend Monero Rapé, one of Mexico's great political cartoonists, with the caricature there of what's being called Norma Pinochet. Norma Pinochet.
Pinochetista.
Right? Yeah. Pinochetista. Right? But this is how lawfare rolls. They will try any ridiculous legal procedure, and then they'll have all their lackeys and cronies and international journals saying, oh, look, she's disobeying the Supreme Court. We told you they were authoritarian. They don't tell you how hollow the whole thing is. To try to create a perception. Right? That's what's going on here.
And I think it's been really positive really encouraging to see Sheinbaum's response to this, because there are some voices out there, and it was actually my original reaction to this was, let's impeach him, get rid of him. You want to act against the population, get ready. And she's like, whoa, we're not going to do that, right? Because if we do that, they're going to say that we're the authoritarians. That look how terrible they are, ousting the sitting Supreme Court president, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, what she's been doing has been emphasizing the long democratic decisions that led to this, which includes, yes, the election where almost 60% voted for Claudia Sheinbaum, where 36 million people voted for the candidacy of Morena and its allies, but also all of the elections that have happened since at the local level, at the state level, that allowed for Morena majorities in the Congress that also approved this, right? That the discussions that happened on the streets, the discussions that happened during the campaign, where it was explicit, none of this was a surprise. This wasn't like Felipe Calderón in 2006, who never talked about launching a war on the cartels and then did so in order to shore up his legitimacy. No, this was discussed. And if I really liked her answer, and it made me realize that my knee-jerk reaction was wrong, right? She's like, we're Democrats. In fact, we are so democratic that what we're doing is asking the population to elect their judges. I actually think that's the absolutely appropriate response. How can you be an authoritarian if what you're doing is actually relinquishing decision-making power and giving it back to the people? I think that's the absolutely most appropriate response, and I'm really glad, and also pushing forward. In the morning press conference today, they said if the Supreme Court or the rest of the judicial branch doesn't want to cooperate, doesn't want to give us the information we need to move forward with this mandate, then the Senate is now empowered to find this information on their own. So they're going to try
the vacancies, right? The vacancies that need to be filled. If they don't want to tell us what the vacancies are, all right, we'll find them.
Yep, the information is public. We'll figure it out, right? We're talking about the entire apparatus of the state working on this. And so this will proceed. There's no discussion about it. Like I said, so Mexico has a permanent constituent assembly, and the sovereignty lies in the people. The way that works is that 2/3 of the Congress, that is both houses, along with a majority of the local Congresses, can permanently change the Constitution. That's the way that our Magna Carta is written. There's no more room for discussion. It's been approved. It's the Constitution. There's nothing more to discuss. Now, they can continue to go with their coup plotting exercises if they want. And you're right. I think that the key takeaway is the reason they're doing this is because it's a trial balloon, right? That's why you hear this talk about, well, the Corte de Derechos Humanos issued a ruling when it comes to Chile's constitution. Now, of course, it's not the same, right? Chile's constitution is a product of a dictatorship. It doesn't have a democratic legitimacy. But even then, right, trying to cite other countries' experiences, I've heard lots of talk about Bolivia. No, it's been a disaster there, right? To try to impede this. But no, there's a decision has been made. And it's interesting to see the responses even from people on the opposition. So the president shared this actually today, and I think it's worth sharing. So this is Diego Valadez. So he's a researcher. He's an academic from Instituto de Jurídicas in UNAM, National Autonomous University.
And no leftist by any means. No, not a leftist by any means.
No. And clearly he was very critical of the judicial reform, right? But some sense to this gentleman here. He says, we know it was going to pass with the supermajority in the Congress, and it happened. And at that time, I fought against it. The institutional health of the country demands serenity on the part of everybody. It is counterproductive to disorient society. The content of a constitutional reform cannot be challenged. Point made. That's it, right? Whatever they're doing, it's all an exercise that responds to something else, which I think is summarized here. Eduardo Andrade, he's a Morena sympathizer. He's a TV personality, but he's also a lawyer. He's also a professor. You can read his bio there. Apparently, he's written 16 books. Wow, I had no idea. He makes a point here, which is actually criticizing one of the sitting Supreme Court ministers who was appointed by López Obrador, actually, who at one point was being asked this very same question. Can a constitutional reform be challenged? Because remember, there was a period there where there was a lot of neoliberal constitutional reforms. Funny how the challenges didn't move forward then, how the Supreme Court allowed them to go through.
And people tried, and they threw them out. And they threw them out with the exact same reasoning. You can't rule on constitutional amendment.
And those reforms went against the social character of a revolutionary constitution. You have to remember, the 1970 Constitution is a product of an uprising in this country. But anyway, it is what it is. It's done. That was the past. Those were the political circumstances of the time. Anyway, there was a different discussion happening around this. And at the time, she's like, no, you can't challenge. But this time voted with the majority at the Supreme Court, along with Norma Piñachetistas, to explore the possibility to maybe challenge in the future the constitutional reform that has already passed, right? And I think he makes a really good point. In this video, you can see the good judicial criteria that this then candidate for the Supreme Court expressed has now been substituted by a political position. The position of Norma Piña and the rest of the other 7 who voted for this is a political position. It responds to a political conjuncture. It is not this kind of abstract, no, we're just jurists, we're just analyzing. No. What's that classic saying? You want 2 opinions? Hire 2 lawyers. The truth is that there's an effort here to try to confuse the population to say that, no, we're just making legal arguments. This has nothing to do with us being opposed to Morena and its supermajority. No, it is a political position, and it's very unfortunate that some of them are falling to this. But ultimately, I do also think that there is a sleeve up Sheinbaum's hand, which is, if it really push comes to shove, she can call for mass demonstration and show that the population are in favor of this. And I think that'll be an important test, like we saw with López Obrador around these issues, where they had that 500,000 people in the streets of Mexico City.
Keeping her powder dry so far, and I think that's right. And another point on this, and here's our Mexican phrase of the day: you can't be juez y parte.
Yeah,
you can't be at the same time judge and interested party. It's a contradiction. It's a conflict of interest, right? You can't be, judging on something that affects your personal interests and your salaries and your perks and all that stuff that they've lived very high in the hog for years, right? Which is why judges are supposed to recuse themselves from cases in which they have an interest, right? You can't be juez y parte here.
And one final point on this that I wanted to make, which is that how disappointed I was to see the Centro PRODE also join in on this charade of wanting to trample over what is a very clear democratic expression of the vast majority of people. Now, obviously, I'm a student of human rights, so I'd speak with a certain place of authority when it comes to this. Obviously, minority rights are not subject to the will of the majority. There is a long tradition of making sure that those are protected precisely because there are certain issues that if they were left to a simple vote of the majority would actually go against rights. But what they're doing here is actually against the advancement of human rights in this country. Why do I say that? So their position here, they shared this tweet initially where they say to judge the very initial admission of the consultation by majority in the Supreme Court to call it a coup d'etat is disproportionate. The discussion over the limits of the reforming power of the Constitution is frequent in contemporary constitutionalism and very relevant in the defense of human rights. And that's what we've been saying since the judicial reform was approved. It's true. The sort of limits in terms of the power of a majority to affect the rights of a minority is a discussion in the human rights community. But what Centro PRODE here is doing is basically falling into the trap of playing politics by trying to mask it as something that is apolitical. So I think their interpretation of the defense of human rights in this case, as I say here, is leading down a path that ultimately harms the advance of human rights. The constitutional oversight that they advocate for has led them to back an anti-democratic move by the Supreme Court. It's ultimately a reactionary position. One of the things that we say here in the human rights community is that rights are interdependent, right? So you can't have these rights being restricted and these other ones being enabled. If they don't coexist, then you're not actually seeing an advancement of rights. When you stick up for one of the remaining strongholds of conservative thought and of conservative political action in this country, what you're actually doing is impeding the advancement of human rights in a whole. So the efforts to make real what the Constitution says when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare, right? All of that kinds of social, economic, cultural rights that we have seen a very clear advancement in this country under the López Obrador government and now with Claudia Sheinbaum are only made possible because of a political fight against the conservatives who are trying to keep that from happening. And so if you empower them to have these strongholds, to say, actually, you can't reform the Constitution this way, then what you're doing is actually impeding the advancement of human rights, because all those other human rights will not be able to be realized because you'll have one branch of government above the rest of them saying, you can't do this. Let's not forget that this same Supreme Court actually stopped the energy reform, which is aimed at guaranteeing the right to electricity, because it affected competitiveness in the country. That's a conservative position. It's a pro-market position. It's a pro-neoliberal position. It is a political position. And it is actually to the detriment of human rights in this country. So nothing about the judicial branch is actually negatively impacting the rights of minorities in this country. So this argument that there needs to be kind of a revision doesn't really apply in this instance. Now, if there is a vote around reproductive rights, right? And it turns out the majority of Mexicans do not support the right of a woman to decide over her own body. That's the kind of thing where there should be intervening, because that does directly affect rights. In this case, that's not what's happening. So it's really unfortunate that an organization that actually has done positive work, the first one that comes to mind is Ayotzinapa. They played a key role there in advancing the cause of the parents of the forcibly disappeared students, is now taking what is essentially a reactionary position that harms human rights because it empowers the enemies of human rights in Mexico. And this is really shameful, and they should be ashamed of themselves. We're going to move on to our next topic here, the Mexico-U.S. gun lawsuit. So the development here is, and the headline says it, can Mexico sue U.S. gun companies? The Supreme Court will decide. So this Friday, it was announced that the Supreme Court will decide if Mexico can try. So there's the actual question of whether or not they're liable or not is not really on the agenda. It's whether or not this actually can be decided by a court over the violence that is being produced as a result of these guns being able to basically freely flow into Mexico, which is contributing to the security situation in this country. But Kurt, maybe you could jump in here and maybe remind our viewers and listeners, what is this case about? How is it that Mexico has gone to the courts around this issue?
So, as we know, sadly in the U.S., gun manufacturers have quite a degree of liability, protection from liability. About how the guns that they sell are used, to commit the atrocities that are committed, right? So, back in AMLO's term, early on, Foreign Minister then Foreign Minister, now Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard was spurring this on. Right? Mexico formally sued U.S. gun manufacturers for the damage and loss of life caused by the essentially unrestricted flow of U.S. weaponry into Mexico. As it says here in the article, from 70 to 90% of crimes, violent crime in Mexico, are committed with weaponry coming from the United States. I mean, it's just a staggering number. It's a staggering number, right? Don't forget that Mexico has very strict gun control laws. Right? There's only one gun shop in the country, and that's in Mexico City, and you need, a license and a permit to get it. So, gun ownership is very significantly restricted. That does not mean that there aren't places in the country where people have plenty of, of weapons, black market weapons, Chiapas being an example, right? But Mexico does have strict gun control laws on the books, right? Which are constantly and tragically undermined by this flow of weaponry coming into the United States. Actually, the one federal government program that existed to track where these weapons are coming from was actually, making some progress, was actually dismantled, not defunded, by the Biden administration. So there you go on that. I mean, the lobby in the United States is huge, as we know. So Mexico sues in a Massachusetts court a strategic move, thinking that they'll likely get a more fair hearing here. And to that extent, they were right. I think they had an initially adverse ruling, and then the court said that the suit could go ahead. Right? Mexico, proved that the harm has been done, and they're an international. They're separate countries, so they're not affected by the national, immunity given to these manufacturers. That's the argument. And this is when, of course, the same interest as always stepped in and took it to the Supreme Court, Smith and Wesson and others, right? Whitmer Public Safety Group, which is their the arms of these things, right? To say that the Supreme Court has to quash this before it ever gets to a ruling. That's what they want. They want to quash this before it ever gets to a ruling, so as not to establish a precedent for future cases, right? Not to have a case that is won by Mexico and then appealed, but to quash it before it ever gets there, cut it off beforehand, right? So what the Supreme Court is going to rule on is whether the Massachusetts court was right to let the case go ahead in the first place, or not just be thrown out. And this is something that Mexico has made the case time and again in diplomatic fora with the United States. Time and again, time and again, time and again. You're not addressing the problem of U.S. weaponry flooding Mexico. And then you say you're against violence, and then you say you're against cartel violence, and then you blame Mexico for this, that, and the other thing. You're supplying the weapons. And, and let's just turn a deaf ear to this constantly, because Mexico is a big, buyer of U.S. weaponry. And the gun lobby likes it. The gun lobby loves it, right? This is why they have the gun show loophole. Right? Like they've historically had the gun show loophole where you can just go to gun shows and you can buy up weaponry, without even a background check, and bring them back across the border. They love it. They love it. Why would they want it to change? Why would they want it to change? They're a great client. So Mexico felt it had no choice but to bring this suit, right? Knowing that it will almost certainly lose, but to bring more notoriety to this issue, which has just been routinely ignored by the United States, just routinely ignored. And it's just the most hypocritical thing you can possibly imagine, to blame a country for the violence that your weapons are causing. And it's just the most blatant hypocrisy you can imagine. And sadly, there's no signs that this is going to change anytime soon, Jose Luis.
That's really the crux of the issue, is that the gun companies, it hasn't been proven in a court, but I think it's reasonable to conclude that they know that these weapons are being used for unlawful purposes. There's actually a specific law, likely a product of the heavy gun lobbying, that protects them from liability. But as the article says here, that's only in the case of lawful actions, right? So basically, you can't sue a gun manufacturer because that gun was used in the commission of a crime or whatever. But like you said, these loopholes exist for a reason. Why? Because it pads their bottom line. Because they're selling a lot of guns and they're making a lot of money, knowing full well where they're ending up, to be used by illegal organized crime groups in illegal actions that are destabilizing Mexico and creating these security problems. You're right. It's very unlikely this is going to actually be successful, but it's worthwhile to pursue it. I actually think it's a smart use to actually highlight how much of a role the U.S. actually has when it comes to this. Maybe they need to approve a new law that actually cracks down on the illegal export of guns from the U.S. into Mexico. They love to lecture about the so-called, drugs and rapists and murderers that are coming up from Mexico, but they never talk about their role in this, which is not just the demand for the drugs that fuel the organized crime world, but actually supplying the weapons that are making this fine. I mean, it's extraordinary. If you do a little bit of digging, it doesn't actually take much. You see some really heavy weaponry in the hands of organized crime groups. We're talking about grenade launchers, rocket launchers, armored vehicles, right? Automatic weapons, the kind of thing, as we say here in Mexico, that
military
are
grade weaponry
of the military. They're military grade weapons, making it over the border.
And what they don't want, the ruling aside, Mexico is very likely to lose. They don't want Mexico to be able to make its case in court, because most people in the U.S. don't know this. And if the trial goes ahead, just that, if the trial goes ahead and Mexico is allowed to have its day in court and lay all of this out, they don't want that at all. Terrible publicity. Hence, go to the Supreme Court and cut it off at the pass.
Yep. Okay. Now, we're going to bring you this new segment here. Good news from Mexico. We're going to have lots of stuff to talk about, but I figured we mentioned this one because, wow, did it make a lot of headlines back in the day when Lopez Obrador canceled that airport that was going to be built on a lake bed that is now today a park. I actually visited. It's really quite nice, and it's nice. It was a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime decision. You know, if they had built that airport on the lake like they intended to do, it would have irreparably changed the ecosystem of the Valley of Mexico. And who knows how long we would have paid the price for that. So I'm very glad with that decision. Obviously, they built a different airport somewhere else on an old military base called Santa Lucia. And boy, the criticism that we heard at the time, oh, this is just a bus terminal pretending to be an airport. It's so ugly. The other one was going to be made by a world-renowned architect and all of this and all of that. And it was going to be Mexico's doorway, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, we got this cheap, crappy version. Well, guess what? The AIFA airport, the Aeropuerto Internacional Felipe Ángeles, which is named after a revolutionary general, Felipe Ángeles, little known. Actually, naming the airport after him kind of brought him back into the popular consciousness.
Right.
Built there, just won a prestigious award. It won an architectural award design from an architectural company that dedicates to highlighting the best of architectural advancements in the world. So this isn't some Mexican group. This is a international organization that decided to award the airport this prize. I've actually never been, but you have. So what were your impressions of this very controversial airport that they still mention?
Well, it's so funny, right? They called it, like you said, a bus terminal, the Central Camionera, right?
Yeah.
And they also said that that planes weren't going to be able to lift off because there's a hill over on one side, so they were going to crash into the hill, and it was going to there was going to be conflict between the flight routes between the Mexico City International Airport downtown and this one, and the flight paths were going to crash. It was just this apocalyptic thing. Flights crashing in the air and hitting hills and the bus station. It's just because there were a lot of interests in that Texcoco airport. There were just a lot of interests there. I mean, imagine putting an airport on top of a lake bed. I mean, just imagine that. Right?
They had to destroy 100 mountains
to lay the bill. Yeah. So, I've used the airport several times to go to and fro from Oaxaca, and it's a spiffy, state-of-the-art airport. It really is. Very effective. Right? And what they're doing now, and I think which is important, because I think the one issue that it's had since it's opened has been the transportation to get there. It's a little tricky. There's a bus station right connected to the airport, and there are bus routes that take you into, Indios Verdes, the metro stop, or Terminal del Norte bus station, or downtown, right, to Auditorio. There's lots of different bus routes. You can get there, right? You just have to, sometimes wait a little bit for the buses to actually leave. But if you want to get an Uber or something, it's a little expensive. It's a little bit farther out. And people are saying, "Oh, how could the airport be so far out of town?" It's like, have you been to other cities that have airports way out of town? I lived in Milan for a time. Malpensa is way out, way out. A bunch of them are, right? So it's just these ridiculous arguments, right? And so very soon they're going to open a train link between the Buena Vista station in Mexico City, linking up with the AIFA, and then the Sheinbaum administration is going to continue that train route to Pachuca Hidalgo. So you'll be able to get to Pachuca Hidalgo in an hour 20, I think. But that said, very, very handsome airport, and certainly very deserving of that prize.
Well, before we move on, there's one thing you haven't mentioned, which is that beautiful quote that's on the walls there. I was trying to find a picture of it, but I couldn't find it. So maybe if you know it off the top of your head.
Well, it was basically that Felipe Ángeles, I'll try to find it as well, that he had his encounter with socialism in the United States, right? He was in exile in the U.S. for a while, right? So it's an interesting kind of a nod to a left-wing general, right, here, who was actually very important in the revolution. He was sent to Morelos to pacify, in quotes, the Villistas, the original Villistas, and didn't use force against them. That was his big thing. It's like he negotiated. He didn't crack down on the Villistas, right? And actually was a very important figure in the revolution. So I mean, it was a very interesting choice. Let's just put it that way. Right?
I mean, I think it was a very deliberate choice,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
A little wink to all the U.S. visitors who are going to be
yeah,
landing at that airport. Hey, it turns out the dreaded S word socialism
yeah.
actually has life in the United States, and turns out a key figure in our history here learned about that there. That was a nice, really touch. People have always praised the bathrooms there. They're all they have a theme. The actual you can see in the picture here, the control tower is actually modeled around an ancient Mexica weapon that was used by the warriors of that society. So anyway, I'm glad to see that it gets the recognition that it deserves, and that all of these kind of ridiculing comments that were made at the time turned out to not be true. Right? It turns out it's a nice project and worthy of awards. So that's a
Yeah.
little bit of good news from Mexico. And we're going to be bringing you that from now on, a little bit just of the things that are happening. In fact, before we started, I said if I didn't have this one, I would have mentioned the fact that today Claudia announced that they're now going to starting to be doing home visits, building on a preventative model of public health. Reminds me a lot of the Cuban model, actually, which does emphasize a lot of how that
Home
close
visits for
proximity.
distinguished citizens, right, to detect diseases and other things before they get to emergency rooms. Right?
Exactly. And that's what was mentioned this morning, right? So
Mhm.
anyway, had I hadn't been for this story, I would have talked about that. There's lots of good stuff happening that we should also be talking about. But of course, what else do we have out there? Well, it's the losers and haters. And this week we have from G. Patrick Lynch, Mexico's slow motion disaster.
Oh,
Bulldozing.
disaster like last week.
All right. I mean, there's no surprises here in terms of what you're going to read. But nonetheless, I think there's a couple of things here that I wanted to highlight in terms of kind of the the exaggeration and all these efforts to kind of paint what is a country that is on the rise, where people are feeling happier, where people approve of their government, which is not something you could say about the United States, regardless of who's in power. But actually,
No.
it's a horrible situation, right? Here in the second paragraph, Mexicans aren't just fleeing their homeland to enter the relatively safe and stable U.S. They're now leaving southern Mexico for Guatemala, of all places, amid the near civil war there between feuding drug lords in Chiapas. As Mexico's political system deteriorates, crime is increasing, and the outgoing president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, completes his quest to eliminate the independence of the country's judiciary. AMLO's administration has followed in the footsteps of other left-wing populist leaders in the Western Hemisphere in Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. He has decried neoliberalism, consolidated power, appealed directly to the poor, working class, and alienated middle class of Mexico. During his time as president, Mexico had many confrontations with the Mexican Supreme Court specifically, and the judiciary more broadly. Particularly in the last few years of his presidency, as his power increased and his respect for the law declined, he and the court clashed as he tried to expand power of the military, pull back from fighting crime, and tried to pause stable, productive economic relations with the U.S. This prompted him to push through a reform that will see every judge throughout Mexico subject to regular election, not lifetime appointment as American federal judges are, and Mexican judges were previously.
Now that's just false. That's just a lie right there. That's just
I
a
mean,
lie
that's
right
one of
there.
many,
Or the
many lies.
yeah. Before the judicial reform, Mexico's Supreme Court justices were already term limited. You could have looked that up in 30 seconds. They were already term limited. What they're doing now is just reducing their terms a little bit. They were already term limited. You fatuous, think tank lout, Do your research. It's just so pathetic. He also says a little bit farther down, and I love this one too. Where is it? That Mexico's infrastructure projects are in direct violation of the Mexican Constitution. Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
I didn't even make it that far. Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Right. And this is just the same garbage in, garbage out. What's important here, besides these laughable articles that you can just debunk in seconds because they're just full of, either they're just dumb and they don't do their research, or they're lazy, or they're liars, or, all of the above, right? Is what's behind this? What's behind this? Because you see a lot more of this in the U.S. media than you see of us, who live here, who studied here, who research here, who are spending all our time, with our ear on the ground and reading and researching and interviewing. You're not going to hear from us in the mainstream media. You're going to hear from a lot of them. The American Institute for Economic Research is, a Koch Foundation vehicle, right? The president of the AIER is a former Koch person, right? And they get Koch money. right? The Charles Koch Foundation, right? And they place a lot of people in the media. And that's the most worrying thing about this. I pulled up their annual report for 2023, and on their media highlights page, I just want to read where, all of their, their farm team of liars appear. Wall Street Journal, Fox News, CBS News, New York Post, Washington Post, BBC World News, Forbes, CNBC, Daily Mail, U.S. News and World Report, Political, CNN, Yahoo News and Finance, NPR, Sirius XM, Bloomberg, Boston Globe, Newsmax, The Hill, Fortune, Business Insider, Seeking Alpha, Fox Nation, Washington Examiner, C-SPAN, International Business Times, Fox, U.S. Today, and many more.
Wow.
Right? So you see this bilge written. It gets the veneer of something serious, because it's the American blah, blah, blah Institute. And then they just funnel these people into mainstream media, which, with all of their cutbacks in the newsroom and cutbacks of investigative teams, and firing of reporters and layoffs, are all too happy to just get the copy from these, from these think tanks and just run it. Or just get their, talking head and give them an interview. Right? It's just very easy. It's plug and play. It's plug and play for the networks, right? And of course, it aligns with them ideologically, so all the better. And there's never any, pushback or calling out the lies, ever. So then they just get recycled and repeated, right? Like the whole thing about Narco AMLO, which is also in there, right? That Morena's in cahoots with Narco, right? That was a lie that was propagated by DEA leaks and then, laundered through ProPublica, Deutsche Welle, Insight Crime, the New York Times. And then you get these, these think tanks that will just take that and run with it in the same. And they just launder each other's lies. So that's one point. Now, the author himself, G. Patrick Lynch, J. Patrick Lynch there, God, is a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund. Now, what does the Liberty Fund do? It was founded by entrepreneur Pierre F. Goodrich in 1960. They're all libertarian organizations. But what's really interesting is their work in skewing the U.S. judicial branch. Right? And this is something even Al Gore wrote about. Gore wrote that between 2002 and 2004, 97% of the attendees at Liberty Fund training seminars for judges were Republican administration appointees. Such conferences and seminars are one of the reasons that judges who regularly attend such conferences are generally responsible for writing the most radical, pro-corporate, anti-environmental, and activist decisions. These groups, Gore says, are not providing unbiased judicial education. They are giving multi-$1,000 vacations to federal judges to promote their radical right-wing agenda at the expense of the public interest. Well. The same institute that is skewing the U.S. judiciary is all up in arms about Mexico's judicial reform. Hypocrisy much? $1,000 vacations to judges under the name, under the veneer of judicial training to, train them in writing radical pro-corporate decisions like we're seeing coming out like clockwork out of the U.S. judiciary, thanks to, among others, Liberty Fund.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we see, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito flying around the world with all expenses paid, VIP vacations. Well, other judges are getting this too. Right? Pretty nice. And then they have the gall to opine about Mexico's judicial reform that makes judges subject to democratic election. You see the difference? You see the connection? You see what's going on here? It's right there in your face. And that's the bilge you get fed at through all the media outlets I just read in the list that have these people on.
And when you read things like educates people on the value of personal freedom, free enterprise, property rights, limited government, and sound money, all you need to do is think, this is the billionaires' agenda. This is what the billionaires want us to think and feel about the economic system. Mm-hmm. Not because it benefits you, but because it benefits them. And they have all the resources in the world to advance that agenda and put forward absurd things like Brazilians should keep slashing their rainforests.
How about that? Keep cutting it all down. Yeah.
this world would be a very ugly place. It's up to us. It's up to the masses. It's about people using the democratic instruments at their disposal to be able to stop that, which is one of the reasons why I'm in support of this constitutional reform that will now see judges elected. As I said many times before, trust the masses. I think if there's a judge who's going to allow the rainforest, right, La Selva Lacandona here in Mexico, is one of the largest lungs of the world. Well, there's one that's going to allow for corporations to come in there and pillage it, and one who's going to protect it. I think it's pretty obvious who they're going to vote for. They want to protect their lives. They want to protect their culture. They want to protect their territories. We want to protect our way of life. We want to live plentiful, but not the way that the billionaires want, at the expense of everybody else.
And not allow libertarian think tanks to take judges to these cushy training seminars, which are really vacations, and program them to come back and give them the rulings they want. That's okay. That's okay. That's fine. But democratic electing judges, no, that's bad. Very, very bad. Come on.
All right, Kurt. Great show today. We reached the end of another program, talking a lot about everything that's happening really quick. I'm actually really making a point of making sure I tune into the mañaneras in this early period, watching the full thing.
Zippier mañaneras, right?
They're zippier. Yeah. I know there are people who will miss López Obrador style, and they think he was very unique in the way that he did it. But a part of me as a journalist, I have to confess, I do appreciate them being just a little bit sharper, a little bit faster, so we can get all of the news and be able to present it to you.
How funny it is that daily hour-and-a-half press conferences are now considered to be zippy.
I know, right? What am I saying?
So long.
What did she say the other day? Ooh, we went long by 7 minutes.
We're 8 minutes over. It was 9:08. It's like, all right, under new management here, right? AMLO was just launching into another story at that point.
All right.
Definitely.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us. As always, like and subscribe, share with your friends, and a special shout out to all of our members of the St. Patrick's Battalion who are supporting us. We really do appreciate it. We actually got the first deposit.
Join and subscribe, please. That helps us do our work.
Yes, thank you so much. Like I said, we're doing this because that niche needs to be filled. And we're happy to have the support of the population over there who's watching and listening to us. But please, like and subscribe, share with your friends. It really helps us out. Kurt, any last words?
My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin and Sentido Común. Join us next week for another edition of, I'm going to spell it out for you, Aina Rebus. Otherwise, Soberanía.
We'll see you next time.